also an advisor on Hack Club, which is a nonprofit which is powering this hackathon. And he is also the creator of Redwood.js, which is a JavaScript framework, which is going to be the main topic of today's Fireside. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that covers it all. I do angel investing, and I have a family foundation, Preston-Werner Ventures, that I use to do angel investing, as well as a lot of climate-focused grant making and investments in climate action.
Yeah, it's really cool. So first, just to begin with, can you tell us a bit about Redwood.js and really what makes it different from other JavaScript frameworks?
Yeah, so Redwood.js is my take on a web application framework. We like to talk about it as the app framework for startups. So a lot of what we're doing with the community and with everything that we're building is aimed at making it easier for startups to get going and to go for the long haul in the code that you're building. So for instance, some of the things that make Redwood unique are we use GraphQL as the communication layer from the front end to the back end. Right now it's a React-based front end that you'll write to talk to a GraphQL API that you build out on the back end. And we have a lot of really great technology to make that as simple as possible for you to write your GraphQL API. As I know, writing a GraphQL API can be a bit daunting sometimes. So we try to make that as easy as possible. And the reason that we do that is to make it possible so that you can have multiple clients. If you're building a startup, often you'll have a web application. You'll then start creating maybe a mobile client. You might have a command line interface, terminal application. Down the road, you might create applications for a native desktop application using Electron or something like that. You might want to have an application that runs on a smartwatch or a smart TV, or to run in an automobile. So as startups progress, often you'll find yourself wanting to create multiple clients. And with this architecture that Redwood.js provides, you create a single backend GraphQL API, and then you can have as many front-end clients as you need. So the first client side that we've created is React-based, but there's nothing to say that we can't create a Vue-based front end or a Svelte-based front end. We intend to work on a React Native mobile client that's fully integrated with Redwood, make that really easy to spin up. So really, we're just getting started on the technology side of making it easy to build a startup. So I'd say that's one differentiating factor, is really that focus on having technology that is designed for long-term maintainability that startups need, making it really well structured and separating the concerns of front end and back end and other things, so that when it comes time to hire separate teams to build those things, that those are already in place and the technology doesn't get in your way to do that. Otherwise, the technologies that we've chosen, React, GraphQL, Prisma on the back end to talk to a database. We integrate Storybook, which is a design system kind of tooling to be able to not only develop your React components in isolation without having to have them in your application, which means that you can just feed them dummy data, mock data, and see them in all the different states that you want during design time, instead of trying to get your database into a specific state so that you can see your components a certain way and struggling with that in your actual application. Integrates Storybook out of the box, as well as Jest testing with some really nice enhancements on top of that. So all of these things combined.
I think we just lost him. No?
All right. Yeah, I think
Sorry about that. I don't know. I think that was my end.
Yeah. Okay. So seems like Redwood really combines the best aspects of a lot of technologies and kind of bundles it together in one framework. And so does Redwood kind of have a focus on scalability across multiple front end clients? And is that kind of
I apologize. I am attempting to tether to my phone now because I think there are people working on the internet at my house. So that's exciting. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay. They should be able to stay on now. I'm tethered through my phone.
Okay, yeah. So what I was basically saying before is, so it seems like Redwood is kind of a combination of like a lot of different technologies like bundled into one framework. So do you say like Redwood's kind of like a batteries included framework, as in like you don't really need to rely on external things that much, or like
Yeah, in the same way that Ruby on Rails or some of these other similar frameworks really try to include everything that you need out of the box in order to get a full stack web application written, Redwood is the same. Although we go, I think, a step further in trying to include even more in the stack. So things like Storybook that I talked about, just testing with Jest, which is maybe not that weird. A lot of people will do that. But then we have first-class integrations with a variety of authentication providers. We have something like 8 or 9 different third-party authentication providers, as well as what we call a DB auth, which is a way to do your authentication and store all your all your user information in your own database. So we have a whole set of authentication providers that you just run a simple setup script for, and now you have that integration basically ready to go. And on the deploy side, we have a handful of deploy providers like Netlify, Vercel, Render.com, as well as deploying to AWS or even to bare metal servers that are co-located at some data center if you want. However you want to do it, whether you want to go serverless or you want to go a traditional server environment, Redwood architecture allows deployment on both architectures. And I think that's maybe a differentiator as well for Redwood. But all of that comes for free out of the box. Or if you want to set up Tailwind for your CSS styling, you just run a simple command line invocation and it's all integrated. Doing that on your own is a hassle, and it's not something that I think developers should be spending their time on, is like getting your app set up so that you can use Tailwind. With Redwood, it takes about 5 seconds. If you do it manually, it'll take you, maybe up to a half an hour to get everything ironed out, depending on the complexity of your app already.
So recently I've been working on a React Native project, and I just recently found out about Redwood. And I feel like that's the same situation for a lot of people. Like they have an app or like they have a website already built, and then they find out about Redwood and want to use Redwood, but they already have stuff built. So I was wondering if there's any like documentation or advice on integrating Redwood with like an already existing project.
I think that's maybe a little more challenging. If you had an existing database, you could potentially build a Redwood API, the backend, the Redwood API, which you can use by itself. You could use Redwood's API side without using the front end stuff at all if you wanted to use something different, because it's just GraphQL.
Yeah.
And we try to make it really easy to do data fetching with Redwood's front end capabilities using something we call cells to do declarative data fetching. But I'd say Redwood is probably more optimized for Greenfield, just like starting a new application with, because it is quite opinionated about how things are laid out. So I think it's probably not impossible that you could layer on the API on top of an existing database. If you're like, I have my application, but now I want to have a GraphQL API, you could potentially use Redwood to do that. I think that would probably work fairly well as long as your database layout matched what Prisma expected from the schema, and Prisma is pretty flexible, so you could probably make that work. But if you have a traditional React application on the front end, then Redwood is also React, so you could probably port over some of that. The back end is going to be fairly different though, so you might, depending on how you're doing your backend logic, if you're using something like Next.js, you could probably extract out some of your logic that way into the back end. So I think there's ways to do it. I don't know of any specific resources that would talk about migrating from one approach to another, just because there's so many different approaches that people might take that it's hard to write something that would be comprehensive enough to maybe be super meaningful. It would be more of a case study. So I think we'll maybe see more of those as Redwood matures.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also like, so what problem were you really trying to solve when you created Redwood? And like, what was kind of like the driving factor for like wanting to create it?
Yeah, the first motivation was when I saw what Netlify was doing. So Netlify is a deploy provider for the Jamstack. So you're pre-rendering or you're delivering things that are statically generated. But then they added the ability to create Lambda functions on AWS by just putting the code right in your same repository, and they would handle everything to get that running as a Lambda function. And I thought that was so cool, and it made me think that there might be an approach for creating a full stack application based on that architecture, where you have some kind of a statically deliverable front end, which React does very well. You could put your business logic into AWS Lambdas. You'd need to have a database somewhere and talk to that. But that architecture struck me as something that would be really powerful from a scaling perspective, using Lambdas, using a serverless environment. And so Redwood started out as really trying to create what we called Jamstack for the full stack for the Jamstack. That was our sort of original tagline. We've dropped that because it's not really that anymore. But that was really the problem that we were trying to solve, was to say, if you want to use a Jamstack serverless type of architecture for a full stack application, there weren't really any frameworks that were helping you do that. And so that's what I wanted to build. Nobody else seemed to be doing it. So I was like, well, I'll try my hand at doing this. And I hadn't written a web framework before, so I thought that that would be interesting. And that was the initial problem set that we were solving. And now, as Redwood has evolved, and as we've seen people in the community start building their applications and startups, to me, the sophistication of Redwood and the focus on integration, separation of concerns with GraphQL, focus on long-term maintainability, that matched more the startup market than it did kind of this other thing that was more technology based. And so that's why we've done this sort of pivot in targeting of a market and also the marketing message.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Anyway, so recently I noticed you had like a few days of announcements leading up to a big announcement, which was like a seed fund for Redwood startups. So I was wondering if you could like provide some more information about that, and also like your plans in the future for kind of like continuing to cultivate the Redwood community.
Yeah, so this week, today's Friday, this week was our launch week for Redwood.js version 1.0. So we've been working on it for more than 2 years. About 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, we released version 0.1. That was the first publicly available version that we put out there. We'd been working on it for maybe 6 months before that to get it into shape for a v0.1. So this week, 2 years later, is the launch week. So we had all kinds of events the whole week. And yes, yesterday I announced the Redwood Startup Fund, which is kind of a seed fund that I mentioned before, 25 to 50K checks to startups based on Redwood.js. And there's a couple of goals that I have with that effort. And that will come through the angel investing that I do. I'll carve out $1 million fund to do that with, but it'll happen through Preston-Werner Ventures, which is the vehicle that I use to do all of my angel investing. So I have a couple of goals. The first is to help startups get money, right? This is something that we haven't so far been able to do directly with Redwood.js, but now combining this effort with the technology, not only can we provide technology, documentation, the community, and all of that, but we can now provide direct funding to the most promising ideas and people. And another goal that I have with this fund is to increase the diversity of startup founders that we see in our community. Over the last 6 months, startups based on Redwood have been able to raise over $19 million in funding, but the demographics of those people are almost exclusively white and male. And we see that in the Redwood community in general. It's, as you see in many open source communities, that they skew towards white and male. And I'd like to see that change. And so part of what I want to do with the Redwood Startup Fund is to prioritize founders who are Black developers, women developers, other minoritized groups, or developers, people that maybe otherwise wouldn't have a chance to get into the startup game. I want to be able to provide funding to those people to increase the diversity of the kinds of people that we see in the Redwood community and in the startup community in general. And the third focus
Yeah, I think he froze, but I think he'll.
Sorry about that. Again, you would think that I could have a stable internet connection, but we just moved into this house, and there's workers here like every day, and I'm home because my kid is sick, and so it's like a tornado of bad internet events.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I think like the whole concept of like using venture capital and like investing as not just a way to make more money, but also as a way to, kind of like you said, increase representation in like the startup community and also like create direct funding for Redwood startups. And also I think your main venture fund like also does climate. I think that's a really cool like proposition. And I think it's like a good thing to do, rather than just try and make more money.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the money for me is a way to make things happen versus, money's whatever, right? But like the real thing for me is that money can do is to encourage people to do things, compensate people for doing things, and try to change the world for the better through the action of people. And sometimes it takes money to do that. So if I can encourage people to try out Redwood and I can try to increase the demographic diversity of startup founders, then I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah, sure. Also, for your main venture fund, like how long have you been running it? It's like if you could provide some.
Well, the first angel investment that I ever did, I think, was in 2012. I made an investment early on in Stripe, so I'm still waiting to see where that, how that turns out. But I have high hopes for that one. So, but that was the first one that I ever did, and then I just sort of dabbled. I only did a handful over the next couple of years. Now I'm doing around 20 to 30 investments each year. I usually do check sizes of 25 to 100K, depending on where the startup is at in their journey and how I feel about it. Sometimes I'll participate in A and B rounds, though more rarely. So I guess I've been doing it for 10 years, but on the side, I guess I've gotten more serious about it as time has gone on. But I still do it on the side. It's not my primary thing that I do. It's sort of one of the three primary things that I do. I should probably learn to focus more, but there's just so much to be done.
A lot of stuff to be done, yeah. And also, like you mentioned, people. Like, who else is kind of helping out on Redwood? And like, if there's any core team members you'd like to shout out, and like, how'd you kind of build out that team as time went on?
Yeah, the team is amazing. So early on, I talked to my friend David Price, who's on the core team now. He was maybe one of the first people that I ever talked to about the idea more than 3 years ago, just before I even knew what it meant. Was this idea around like, hey, Netlify has this technology, like what could be done with this around building an app, a web app framework. And then I was working at a company called Chatterbug that I founded. That's a foreign language learning startup, chatterbug.com. And there I met a guy named Peter Pistorius, who is also a co-creator of Redwood and wrote a lot of the initial JavaScript for it, because at the time I was not, let's say, the most advanced JavaScript developer in the world. I was still kind of learning myself, but saw opportunities in that space. And so he really did the heavy lifting on a lot of the React stuff and some of the more magical things that we do with Webpack. So Peter and I really started working on it in earnest 2.5 years ago or so. And so he's been an integral part of Redwood. There would be no Redwood without him. I don't think I would have been able to make enough progress on my own to really get more people interested in it. And then my good friend for many years, Rob Cameron, is also a co-creator, and he came on shortly after that to help out. He did all of the tutorial series and has been integral in huge parts of the code base as well. But he works sort of across things. You might see some of his entertaining video productions as well that he's been doing. We like to have a little bit of fun. So that's the core team, the original founding team. And since then, we've had more than, I think now we're up to maybe 30 different people that have come through the core team. Right now, we have about 20 people active on the core team. But some of the most active, Danny Chowdhury in London has been amazing. David Teresen, who's in Boston, these two have just made massive contributions to the framework, and so many others that I can't possibly name them all. We have more than 330 contributors to the open source project. to date, but it's just every day I'm blown away at the amazingness that is coming from the core team and the community as a whole.
Yeah, seems like a community is really starting to form, because I feel like if you build like a good framework, like people come towards it, and I feel like that's what Redwood is. Like it provides a lot more which than other frameworks, and I feel like, yeah, it definitely has a lot of opportunity to like grow and eventually hopefully reach like mainstream adoption, I guess.
That's the goal. Yeah, I mean, it's still early, right? I mean, up until now, we haven't even really told people they should use it in production. And while we have a bunch of startups that have taken funding that are based on Redwood, it hasn't stopped people, but it does stop. It doesn't stop everyone, but it does stop a lot of people. So I'm hoping now that we're 1.0, more people will say, okay, well, let me give this a try. I'm ready to try this out. They say it's ready to use, so I'm ready to try it out. And we've put a huge amount of focus on our tutorial and making the tutorial really easy, reliable, and comprehensive to walk you through most of the features that are available in Redwood. It's quite an extensive tutorial. So if you're interested in anything that I'm saying today, I'd say your first step is go to redwoodjs.com and click on the Start the Tutorial button and just try it out. There's also videos that Rob has done. If you don't want to sit there and do it yourself, just watch Rob do it for you. That's another great way that you can do the tutorial.
Yeah, it makes sense. I actually recently started the tutorial, and it's actually really well done and well put together. So one thing I was wondering is, like, a lot of people, when like deciding a new language or framework to learn, they like look at the career opportunities, which are like associated with like knowing that framework. So I was wondering if like, were there career opportunities like related to Redwood, and like, how is that like kind of growing over time?
Yeah, we now have, there is actually a job board on the website. I believe that's live now, yes. If you go to redwoodjs.com and click on the jobs link, there is a place that you can list yourself as an experienced Redwood developer. And we have people on this list now being hired by startups that are hiring for Redwood. And you'll see more and more every day. So absolutely, there are job opportunities within the Redwood ecosystem. We have a number of people that have gotten jobs by being part of the Redwood ecosystem that come in, they work with us, and through that work, they're able to show that to potential employers and say, hey, you know, here's my contributions to Redwood. Or some of them we invited to the core team because they were so active and they were able to secure jobs for the first time. One of them out of a startup, or sorry, a coding boot camp, came, joined the community, was so energetic, so enthusiastic, and did so much kind of developer advocacy for us that he was able to land a job sort of out of that. And I was able to endorse him to that employer for that job because I knew how amazing he was. So, you know, with the community, we really try to uplift each other, find opportunities for people. That's a part of it. Like a big part of the reason that I do things like this is to create opportunities for other people. It's one of the things that gives me the greatest satisfaction, is to have created something that gives other people opportunities.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And so like if someone else like was interested in like creating a JavaScript framework, like I feel like creating a framework is definitely a big thing. So like how did you guys like start? Like what did you do initially?
It is a large amount of work. Turns out it takes a few years to get to to something that is sophisticated. And I think you'll probably see that commonly across a lot of the frameworks that are coming out today. Things like Remix and Blitz also have been actively developed for several years now. So first of all, be ready for the long haul. Like it's a large effort to reach that level of sophistication. I think the first thing we did was just try to get a proof of concept going, just hack something together, anything together that would run on Netlify, that we could deploy to Netlify and say, all right, here's a React front end talking to business logic on the back end via GraphQL that's going to use Prisma to talk to a database that's hosted somewhere, and try to make that work. That was the proof of concept. And then thinking about how do we want to deal with routing for Redwood. You have a SPA, a single page app React framework. And so how do you want to do routing? I wasn't happy with React Router or the way that the React Router did the nested routing. So I ended up writing my own router for Redwood. And that took a lot of time and effort to get right, but I think it really paid off in the ergonomics that you have with a single routing file and the ability to specify all of your route parameters and things. I think turned out really, really great. I'm really happy with that. So I was just experimenting with the things that we thought might make Redwood different and better than the other options that were out there. So you can start simply. It's reaching, and you can hack something together that works fairly quickly. it's the really like the integrations that become the hard part, and any of the special different things that you want to do where you've got to wrangle Webpack or some other tool to try to make that ergonomics possible. Like we've been focused on developer experience so extensively. Making some of those things happen with Webpack and Babel are tremendously difficult, but we were unwilling to compromise on them. And so those are the things that really took a large amount of time.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like obviously, like Redwood is not, it's not like finished yet. It's still in 1.1. It's still growing. So like, where do you kind of find inspiration to like for new features or like for a new thing to add to the framework? Do you like listen to community feedback? Or like...
Yeah, absolutely. It's really talking to people who are using Redwood and seeing what they want, or just the things that we want as Redwood users ourselves. So one of the big things I'd love to work on is some kind of server-side rendering, SSR capabilities that Next.js is so good at. Redwood is not very good at right now, but there's no reason that we can't be. So right now people will use Next as a front end for the Redwood.js backend and GraphQL, and they'll pull data from GraphQL. And then you can do incremental builds. You can do stale while revalidate the way that Next can. And a lot of people need some kind of behavior like that that is hard in Redwood. We can do static pre-rendering and hydration. And that's really easy. You just add pre-render to the route that you want to be pre-rendered, and we'll pre-render it for you as long as you're not using anything that prevents it from being pre-rendered. But we'd like to be able to do a similar thing for SSR types of behaviors. The architecture of Redwood makes that a little bit challenging right now, but they're totally solvable, and that's a big effort that we'll be undertaking. So there's so much still to be done. There's optimizations around GraphQL and nested GraphQL calls, leading to the so-called waterfall problem of a component fetching data that then it hands to a subcomponent that then fetches its own data, and that can happen, multiple layers, and now you have this cascading kind of loading behavior, which nobody loves. So being able to use some of the new things in React 18, hopefully, to smooth out some of that behavior, things like React suspense, those are efforts that we'll be undertaking now that we've reached 1.0. But there's no lack of ideas for improvements to Redwood. It's more about prioritization.
Okay, of course, that makes sense. Also, it seems like Redwood's a very community-focused framework, and I was wondering, have you guys ever considered like hosting a Redwood hackathon or something like similar, where like the community could like get together to like work on stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the reason that we really haven't focused so much on that now is because we've been focused on 1.0 and really driving to this goal. This has been the primary goal, like really heavily for the past 6 months, where we're like, all right, like we can see 1.0 in the distance. We just have to get it done. Because if we don't get 1.0 out the door, it's never going to happen. Like you have to decide that that's going to happen and make it happen. And that took up all our time. Like every meeting that we had was focused around 1.0, like for the last 6 months. So now that that's happened, I'm hoping that that frees up our time to delve into some other matters, new features, obviously, but also more community related things like hackathons. I'd love to organize a Redwood Conf, a full conference, a 1 or 2 day conference around Redwood sometime, maybe late in the year. So definitely thinking about hackathons and other things is top of mind.
Of course. And what do you say like was the biggest challenge, or like some of the biggest challenges which you faced when creating Redwood?
I think it's just that JavaScript is hard, and the JavaScript ecosystem is challenging, shall we say, right? Like you have to worry about transpiling your code using Babel and like using Webpack to, some of the intricacies of single page applications, route splitting. There's just a lot of technical challenges, and the tooling in JavaScript is still not necessarily up to the task of doing all of this, or even just making it so that people could contribute to the framework itself is quite difficult. To get an application, like create a Redwood application and then have it use the version of Redwood that you're changing, that you're modifying, is non-trivial with things like Yarn or NPM. They just do not make that very easy. So we spent large amounts of time making that flow really easy. And now we finally have it in a place that you can go and contribute to Redwood using Gitpod within 30 seconds. And it's wonderful. I mean, you don't have to install anything locally. It all happens in sort of a Gitpod container. And you should definitely check out Gitpod if you don't know about it. It's like containerized development environments in the cloud. Yeah, so that's been really helpful. But there's all the technical things have been hard. Building a community is always hard. Getting people to even know that Redwood.js exists is hard. Like all of these are hard problems. Everything is hard.
I feel like the general developer community, at least, knows very little about Redwood, and it is a great framework. So I feel like as exposure grows, like more projects will be built on, there'll be more access to career opportunities, and like it'll just kind of snowball, which hopefully over time will happen. Yeah. So like, what type of stuff is like Redwood most like optimized for? Is it kind of like a general purpose like framework?
Well, it's optimized for building a web application in an architecture that is going to scale to larger and more complex efforts, as I kind of mentioned before, using GraphQL, having multiple clients. So it's really optimized, as we say, for startups, for the kind of path that a startup would take. So it's still, it's fairly easy to get started with Redwood, as you can see in the tutorial. It's maybe a little more complex than a Next.js tutorial would be. And I think Next.js is still a really great choice for hackathons, for instance, because you can get up and running so quickly. Doing the same thing with Redwood.js might take you a little bit longer. But if you're working on a side project or something that you intend to exist for long periods of time and to grow and to maybe have a growing team working on, Next.js does not necessarily make that easy. It really has no opinions about most things. Where Redwood.js is designed from the very beginning to try to solve some of those problems for you so that you have less work to do in maintaining your framework and building your own framework. And you just get the opinions that Redwood brings along with you that are informed by my experiences at GitHub and Chatterbug and all the other core team members' experiences building startups and working at larger companies. And so I guess that's what I would say is, you can use it to build anything, but really it's intended to be used for things that you're going to build that are going to last in the long term.
All right, that makes sense. And also, if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask Tom, maybe like about Redwood or anything in general, just like put it in the chat. And yeah, just since some audience participation would also be great. All right. I'll just give people a minute if they have anything they want to say. So like, I noticed you mentioned, okay, yeah, I think Anish said, he asked, is Redwood free?
Yes, I should say this more often. Redwood is open source, MIT licensed, so completely free to use forever. And that's our intention. Even if we someday build a business model around Redwood, Redwood itself will always be open source. That's our primary objective.
And I also noticed you like mentioned Netlify and like other private companies. Like, do you like form partnerships with these companies, or like how do you kind of integrate these products into your framework?
Yeah, I'd say we call them partners. We feel like they're partners. We really coordinate with them quite often. We have a whole bunch of shared Slack channels with the various authentication providers and deploy providers and other technologies that we integrate with Storybook and Jest. And like all of these, we work closely with these companies and open source projects to be able to talk about our needs for Redwood.js as a framework, our use case, to try to encourage the companies to do things that we want. And at the same time, it's great for them to have Redwood as a framework that they can use as sort of lead generation for their products to say, oh, if you're using Redwood, it's really easy to integrate Clerky or OAuth or any of a dozen authentication providers. So it's really to the advantage of the companies to help make that work in Redwood. And so we end up talking back and forth a lot. We're very close with Prisma, the database ORM provider that we use. I've known them since forever. I'm an investor in Prisma. And so we talk very often about our needs, the things that we're seeing, any problems that we'll often see problems in their new releases before anyone else, because we're running it through this really, a very comprehensive test suite that we have for any time that Prisma makes updates or all of these things. So absolutely work very closely with the partners in order to make your life as a Redwood.js developer as smooth and simple as possible.
Yeah, sounds great to hear. I'll just ask like one more question and then we could wrap things up. So like outside of Redwood, like, is there anything else interesting which you're working on, or is that like the main thing which you're focusing all your time towards?
That's probably the most interesting thing for this crowd that I'm working on right now. And it takes quite a bit of my time. to work on it. So that's kind of the technology product that I'm working on most right now. I always like to have some kind of a coding technology project to work on. The three main things that I do are I work on Redwood, I work on sort of the climate and politics side of grant work with Preston-Werner Ventures, and then I also do the technology angel investing around both mostly developer tools, but also increasingly climate startups. Those are kind of the three main things that I do at the moment. And I think there was one more question in chat here. Oh, not a question so much as a comment. The Redwood's documentation you like? Very good. We spent a huge amount of time working on documentation. It's a really big priority for us. So I'm glad that you like it.
Yeah, and I think that's all the questions I had. If there's any like closing remarks you'd like to say about Redwood or like encouragement, that'd be great.
Sure. I'd say go try the tutorial, redwoodjs.com. Start the tutorial buttons all over the place. That's really what we want you to do as your first step in understanding what Redwood can do for you. And if you are interested in building a startup or you want to work on some kind of a side project, I'd say just start working on it. Start with an idea, talk to people, see what they like about it, what they don't like about it, follow the feedback, and keep going. It's amazing what you can build if you work consistently on something for a year. It's really, it is always the most remarkable thing to me on the projects that I work on. When you start from nothing, you start from no code, no documentation, no marketing, no team, nothing. You just have an idea and you consistently work on it for months or years at a time. What you can create in that time period, and then you look back and you say, we created all of this from nothing. That to me is the most magical thing that there is in the world. And if you are interested in that path, try an idea, stick with it for some amount of time, and you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you for your time, and I'll post the video of this on our YouTube channel. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Bye.
Yep.